The rise of new empires. The objectives are: 1. Describe the rise of the Assyrian and Persian empires, which eventually overshadowed the Hittites and Egyptians. And 2, summarize how the Persian Empire brought many years of peace to Southwest Asia, increasing trade and the general well-being of its people. Now, where we last were discussing about Israel being conquered by the Assyrian people, here we want to talk a little bit about who these Assyrian people were. Now, the Assyrians were a Semitic-speaking people who exploited the use of iron weapons to establish an empire by 700 BCE. They're really going to make huge use of this iron technology, which, because of its cheapness relative to bronze, they're able to equip more of their soldiers, more of their army with this metal. Whereas with bronze, the only elite people could really make use of this. And so, of course, this is going to be very important for the conquest of other regions. Now, the Assyrian Empire included Mesopotamia, parts of the Iranian Plateau, sections of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, all the way down to Thebes. Really, the Assyrian Empire at its height expands dramatically due to its political power, its force, its tactics. They were a brutal people. But it was ultimately in 612 BCE that the empire fell to a coalition of Chaldeans and Medes. But really, the Assyrian Empire here was notorious for their exploits and their conquest. The Assyrians, however, beyond the militaristic sort of standpoint, developed an efficient system of communication to administer their empire. This is true in terms of a benefit for most of the people, but nevertheless, it's really devised for kingship and leadership and military orders. So you see a network of posts that were established throughout the empire that were used to relay horses to carry messages from the king to more soldiers, or from one region of the empire to another, which is one of the initial first steps to one of the methods to establish and maintain and control a massive territory. Because that's a problem here in this ancient context, because communication and control of a vast territory is a tricky matter. And so ultimately we end up seeing that this was a brilliant solution by the Assyrians. The Assyrians had the first large armies equipped with iron weapons, as was said before, so this makes them terrifying. But really, what ends up striking terror into the hearts of people is the very use of terror as an instrument of war. You might even argue that this is a true terrorism. That is, the use of fear as a tool for warfare, for conflict, for victory in war. And so they would intentionally, as they marched into regions, lay waste to the land, smashing dams, burning crops, deforesting the fruit trees, leading to starvation. Anytime they would go up against an enemy, they would be brutal, and they would cut and kill many people. In fact, some stories even show that they would go into a city, and that if they refused to release and open the city and just release their king to the Assyrians, then they would torture and kill every man, woman, and child that they could find. In fact, the Assyrians were famous for their infatuation with cutting off various body parts, particularly the nose. They liked to blind people so that they would be maimed for life, but constantly tell others of the terror of the Assyrians. While the torture is pretty dramatic, and torture is maybe a weak word to describe what the Assyrians were most famous for doing to these people, it was a method by which the Assyrians tried to conquer and control other territories around them. Now, ultimately, we see after the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, we see the emergence of a Persian Empire. That is the alliance between the Chaldeans and the Medes that form this Persian Empire. Now, one of the main figures of this era is the king Nebuchadnezzar II, who rebuilt Babylon as the center of his empire. But this resurgence really didn't last. It really didn't hold true to a long trajectory. Now, the Persian Empire were an Indo-European people who lived in modern-day Iran, and they came in and conquered that Babylonian kind of resurgence. And this was really under Cyrus. Cyrus created a powerful Persian state that stretched from Asia Minor to western India. Now, really, Cyrus the Great, who reigned from 559 to 530 BCE, had a reputation for mercy, and that's why he was known as Cyrus the Great, which is really a clear, stark contrast to the Assyrians and the Babylonian Chaldean groups that had come before. Really, so those people who were incorporated into this Persian Empire actually looked upon the king and the rulership of the Persians in a favorable light. Medes, Babylonians, Jews, all accepted their rule because of the favorable way in which they treated those peoples. Now, Cyrus's successors extended the territory of the Persian Empire to dramatic heights. One particular famous king was Darius in 521 to 486. He added a new Persian province in western India, expanding into India, and then extended to the Indus River Valley. Also making conquest in Europe, Thrace, and Greece, really pushing into Greece in a dramatic way. Which will, of course, bring the Greeks and the Persians suddenly into conflict. And this is where we have this classic sort of conflict between these two great people groups and these two massive empires that are even still capturing the attention and the imagination of current filmmakers and readers. Now, what was the structure of the Persian Empire like? Darius strengthened the Persian government by one particular method, by dividing the territory into 20 provinces, or satrapies, and they are governed by a satrap. And these regions or divisions of the massive empire really allowed the king to control such a massive territory, which is really the conflict and the problem of having such a large territory. So we see a major shift in this direction where the Darius or whatever king can focus on controlling the 20 satraps rather than trying to govern the entire kingdom himself. Now, one major feature of the Persian Empire was the royal road, which stretched from Lydia to Susa. It was the chief kind of capital of the empire. Now, the royal road stretched across the empire in such a dramatic way, and it really builds off of what the Assyrians had attempted to do, but made it much more successful. It became increasingly safe for people to travel along this road because so many miles would be a rest stop, not only for exchange of horses for official purposes, but somewhere to sleep, somewhere maybe to get food, certainly for where guards would be stationed to protect the road from bandits. So, of course, these are sort of major changes that lead to stability within that empire. Now, the Persians set up various way stations, of course, for food and shelter, not only for those traveling, but also the wayward traveler. And this will, of course, if you can imagine, would bolster trade because it gives a sense of security. Now, ultimately, the Persian king will be known as the Great King, and he held the power of life and death. Inevitably, we see these kings have grandiose images of themselves that are quite deified and godlike. And the Persian army was ultimately unmatched in size, commanding tens of thousands. Herodotus, in fact, claimed that that the Persians had 1 million soldiers, which is probably a gross exaggeration, but nevertheless, at least tens of thousands, which is a massive number for the ancient world. I mean, this number is ridiculous in terms of how we would conceive of militaries comparatively. And so it's no wonder that the Persian kings were able to completely conquer almost everyone. Now, one of the most important soldiers within this group were the Immortals. They were an elite infantry force that were directly responsible for protecting the king. Now, they were known as immortal because it seemed as if they could never die, not just from their individual fighting ability, but because anytime one immortal had died, then the next one would rise up and take his place. And this pattern continued. So not only were they difficult to die, but they replaced themselves. And so that was garnered them the name then immortal. Now, ultimately, of course, like most civilizations, they fall. And so the fall of the Persian Empire inevitably comes as a result of failure of various kings. After Darius, the Persian kings became more and more isolated at their courts. You see various struggles over the throne that weakened the concept of monarchy, and that weakened the authority of these people. Persian kings had many, many wives, and as a result, as you can imagine, many, many children. One famous example is that Artaxerxes had 115 sons, which means that there are 115 sons that would like to be the king. So, due to those many heirs, you end up having bloody struggles for the throne that with war and fighting and killing and assassination, which ultimately really weakens the empire because you have such a political ambition and struggle going on. Now, of course, there is dominant Persian religions that are really taking hold at this time as well. The most famous, of course, is Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was founded by a prophet named Zoroaster in 660 BCE. He claimed that he had received a vision which made him a prophet of the one true religion. And this was kind of outlined in the Zend-Avesta, which is the sacred kind of textbook of the Zoroastrians, perhaps like the Christian Bible or something. Now, Ahura Mazda was the supreme God who created all things, and he is a monotheistic God. He is a good, kind of good principle that is willing and wanting to support the good light things in this world as opposed to the dark and evil things of this world. And so this dark and evil principle at work in the world is really the result of Ahriman, which is an evil spirit over whom Ahura Mazda must fight and inevitably triumph at the end of days. Which, of course, this religion should sound a lot like Christianity or Judaism. Even you can see some hints of Islam. So any of those monotheistic religions really share a shared heritage of the beliefs with Zoroastrianism. And so it's an important concept and contribution to global history and religion in general. Now, just to remind you, our objectives were 1. Describe the rise of the Assyrian and Persian empires, which eventually overshadowed the Hittites and Egyptians. And 2, summarize how the Persian Empire brought many years of peace to Southwest Asia, increasing trade and the general well-being of its people.